no one wanted to talk about it. I want to talk about masturbation. I want to talk about struggles. And I don't want to like stand up in front of mixed groups and just make it a profane thing. But I want to bring it into the light. I want to say, this is not right. I will not live. I was taught that I was just this dirty sinner who needed to muddle his way through. This is in Bible college.
Yeah.
Who needed to muddle his way through and just do his best until Jesus comes back.
Yeah.
Now I thought there's got to be more to the Christian life than this. There's got to be more to the Christian life and the abundant life Jesus promised than to muddle my way through saddled with this sin.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Naked Gospel. It is our vision and hope to see a revival of sexual dignity and integrity throughout the entire bride of Christ. To that end, we bring on guests to discuss topics from sexual integrity to sexual ethics to marriage to pornography to sex trafficking and everything in between. I am your host, Shane O'Neill. Today we are joined by Dr. Adam McClendon. Adam is a father, a husband, a longtime professor, and he has a wealth of experience in pastoral considerations as well as academic considerations. He's an author, and I'm excited just to sit down with him and dialogue with him today. Adam, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, man, it's good to be here.
Yeah. How you been holding up in the midst of the whole COVID and whatnot?
Okay.
Yeah.
We're surviving like everyone else, but whenever you have six people living in one small space, it always gets interesting. So it's the best of times and the worst of times.
For sure. I think an aspect of it that makes it difficult for me is not knowing the time frame. Like, I have no idea how long this will last.
Right.
Yeah. That are you still at the office? Are you working from home? Like,
I'm working from home most of the time
Okay.
now. Yeah, I'm fortunate to be able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So, like I was mentioning, a lot of pastoral stuff, a lot of academic stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of those things have been able to blend together within your work because oftentimes you're teaching pastors and you're pastoring pastors and whatnot. When it comes to like the issues of sexual integrity and dignity and ethics, have you had any kind of like overt exposure to this predicament in particular? I guess I kind of know the answer to that question because I read this article that you wrote which talks about an experience that you had kind of walking in on a pastor at his church. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. So obviously get an opportunity to do a lot of blogging and some writing and different things like that. And I was sharing about an experience I had. So I was working for a seminary, but I oversaw a 70-room hotel that was there. And this hotel was full service. So what we did was we had to go out and kind of recruit and get people to come in. They had to use catering spaces and stuff like that. Well, because we were attached to a seminary, even though it was a full service hotel, we had certain guidelines by which we had to work by. So I would go out and I would target churches and try to get them to come in. So I'm traveling around one day, and I think it's, I can't remember what day of the week it was. For some reason, I think it was a Tuesday, because a lot of pastors take Mondays off. So I said, hey, Tuesday's going to be a great day. I go out there, and I'm hitting a lot of medium to smaller sized churches and some larger churches as well. And I get to this one church, and I go and knock on a door, and nobody answers. So I go to another door, and that door was unlocked. And I knew there was someone there. I assumed there was, based on some activity, the lights and the parking and stuff like that. Well, I walk in, and there in the what would be called a fellowship hall is a pastor actively watching pornography on a TV screen, a VHS recorder there. What the kids probably watched VeggieTales on just a couple days before for Sunday school at the church.
Yeah.
And the pastor jumps up, runs out of the room, fixing his pants, everything else.
Whoa.
And I just remember that moment.
Shoot. I don't know how you forget it.
And I remember just the emotion of horror, shock, anger, all the things that went into that.
Yeah.
And also the reality that so many pastors are trying to do a public ministry, but they have these private demons that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
And just all of the issues that go into that. And I've counseled with, I don't want to say hundreds at this point, that might be an exaggeration, but a lot of pastors over the years. And this is so common. But to see it in that fashion, I just remember the feeling of being nauseated in that moment.
Yeah, that's a harrowing story. I have no idea what I would do in that situation. It really does necessitate the question, what the heck did you do?
Yeah, so, in that moment, I wanted to run.
Yeah.
I wanted to punch him in the face. I wanted to do a lot of things.
Yeah.
I would handle it differently now. He leaves. He comes back, tries to act like nothing happened, right? And I just look at him with this look of, are we not going to deal with this? And I was so disgusted, I was so angry that I just remember handing him the material and just leaving. Now, where I am today versus, I mean, this was not quite 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I would definitely dive into a conversation.
Yeah.
And I wrestled in my soul. Do I have a responsibility to contact the congregation? Do I
Yeah.
have a responsibility to reach out? Like, what do I do in this moment?
Yeah.
But in that moment, I just remember this feeling of disgust of handing him this and just getting out.
Yeah.
I wish I had done so much more, because here's someone who professes to be a servant of Christ, and they're living with this issue that probably no one else knows about. And here, God allowed me the opportunity to confront him and be exposed to this issue. And now he gets to go back to his isolation.
Yeah.
Sin is like mold. It thrives in darkness. It just does.
Yeah.
And here was an opportunity to kind of address it. And I don't know if he'd been responsive or not, but it was a horrific moment.
Yeah, I believe it. It's obviously stayed with you in vivid detail since then. I can't help but think that only Jesus can orchestrate that kind of event for a moment of light, you know? So I get the reconsideration on your part about, like, what would I have done, you know? Because we see that right now. I mean, obviously you've got, like, the hashtag Me Too movement where, like, a lot of stuff is coming to the surface, but then you've got, like, the hashtag Church Too movement where, like, all of a sudden pastors are being exposed for some of their honestly, it's typically more like abuse stuff or like underage engagement, exploitation with pastors, but like certainly there's been issues with like pornography that's been coming out, and typically that's like underneath all of it, you know, like if you're acting that way, then it's because for a long time you've been acting some other way in isolation by yourself where you thought no one else was looking.
So that's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
And I tell people all the time, no one wakes up one day and says, I want to sabotage my life. I want to sabotage my marriage, my ministry, whatever it is that people are dealing with. Whether you're a vocational minister or not, this is an issue in our life. But what we do is we make one poor decision after another. I call it, we dig a pit a teaspoon at a time. And then after a while, we create a pattern that we get into this mode. And we often get to a place where we become so brazen in our sin, like sitting there in an open space with an unlocked door watching porn. How did he get there? Because he was able to thrive in the darkness for so long. But here's something we need to understand about sin in general. Sin hates staying in the shadows. A sin is like a serial killer. I mean, we use this weird, sick analogy. It loves to be exposed. It wants to work its way to the surface. I mean, Paul does this. He personifies sin in the New Testament. He gives sin almost this attribute of personhood. And he talks about sin in a way that makes you go, this issue in our lives that we think is hidden and we think is innocuous and we think is innocent is not. And over time, it's amazing. And we know theologically, whether it's in this world or the next world, sin is going to be ultimately exposed.
Yeah.
But it's amazing how often it creeps into the light in this world as well when we think we've got it contained.
Yeah. That's helpful, Adam. Thank you for honestly just playing that out. I think, honestly, at this point, it'd be helpful just to jump to the biblical witness when it comes to, I guess, sexual ethics. Because once you have the ethic, then anything else that violates that is sin. So even engaging the issue of sin, like what would you see? Because a lot of times these days there's a huge reaction to kind of purity culture, and a lot of the articulation of sexual ethics has been so many just kind of do's and don'ts. Whereas, you know, the scriptures are a story, a really remarkable story, and so wanting to get a better understanding of that story, I think, goes a long way. In protecting us, but also like giving us something to live into as opposed to do's and don'ts. So just be interested in whether you start in Genesis or you jump in with Jesus or start in Revelation. Like how would you articulate a sexual ethic?
So let me just make one comment. I want to jump back to that story with the guy at the church for just a second.
Yeah.
As I've really reflected over my soul and how I felt in that moment, I think one of the reasons it was so horrific too was not just the reality that someone was doing that, but the reality that I could see myself at a point in time in history doing that.
Yeah.
And I think what I saw in him was also reflective of issues in my heart.
Yeah.
And whenever we're confronted with who we are and how we've approached sin and how we think we've gotten by with stuff, I think there's there's a conviction and a weight that comes with that also that came in that moment. But let's go to your issue of a biblical sexual ethic, right? We are in an over-sexualized culture that honestly sex has become very much of an idol to us on one hand. So we have this over-sexualized culture, and we have a sexualized culture that sometimes, even in the Christian community, has so much freedom that it becomes problematic. On the other end of the spectrum, we have kind of this puritanical sexuality.
Yeah.
I remember counseling with one young man, and they only felt comfortable having sex in one position. Right? Everything else was sinful to them. It was this idea that it was. I've even talked to people that almost have an approach to sex that it's only for procreation. No, it's also for enjoyment. But I have friends on the other side that go too far. I remember getting a call from a gentleman one time. He's actually a good friend of mine. We've been friends for, goodness, almost 20 years as well. And I'm not going to repeat for to keep this appropriately rated on the podcast how he started off the conversation, but he asked me a question: is this activity in sex with my wife appropriate? And I paused for a moment, and it wasn't that the activity was inherently inappropriate, although it was definitely questionable. But I asked this question: what have you been looking at that makes you want to do that? So before we even begin to talk about a biblical sexual ethic, what is it that's driving our cravings in our sexual ethic? I mean, that's just an appropriate question to ask, whether it's food, like, why do I want to run and eat a pizza right now? Eating a pizza isn't inherently wrong. But there's a craving that's driving that is worth the question.
Yeah.
So when we talk about our sexual ethic, let's go back to something like Song of Solomon, right? I mean, we go back to the beginning, Adam and Eve. I believe that they were enjoying a sexual union, which is identified in their marriage and in the fact that they were anticipated to have children. That's why the pain is increased in childbirth. We see sex being distorted very early on. So let's be clear before we get to Song of Solomon. God designed us to be sexual beings. Right? I mean, we see it from the very beginning. And the fact that that is one of the most distorted and blatant sins from the very beginning of the scriptures, from Tamar with her father-in-law and all the different issues that we see in the Old Testament, David and Bathsheba. I mean, we could go on and on, right? Yeah. So it has been a big issue from the beginning of time. Yeah. But let's go to Song of Solomon. Early on in church history, that was kind of allegorized to be a story about Christ and the church. Well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. I tend to lean towards it not being. It's more of a picture of a husband enjoying his wife. But even if it is a story of Christ and his church, it's interesting that God uses the analogy of sexual union and exploration. And by the way, the imagery there demonstrates that sex with an appropriate partner within an appropriate framework was designed to be fun. It was designed to be enjoyable. We see that in 1 Corinthians 7, that if we approach sex within a marriage context, because this is important, it is designed to be a symbol and an activity of covenant. That is just undisputed theologically in the scripture. So I'm going to say it again. It is designed to be a symbol and an activity of covenant. Even in 1 Corinthians 7, where we see your body doesn't belong to yourself, that doesn't mean I have rights to go in and sell my wife. Hey, you have to give me your body. What it means is when I approach sexual activity, I don't do it from the standpoint of solely self-pleasure. I do it from the standpoint that my body exists to bring pleasure to someone else. So a biblical sexual ethic is an ethic that goes back against the curse, right? Because the curse is all about me. And it says my body exists to bring fulfillment and satisfaction to someone else. Yes, my body exists for procreation, but it also exists for this. So in the biblical sexual ethic, I think we need to look at the fact that sex is not evil. It can be. Sex is not dirty. It can be. But within appropriate confines, it is designed to be enjoyed and celebrated as one picture of covenant and union, but not the exclusive picture of covenant and union. So I could go on and on, but I know our listeners are going, okay, let's get to some more stuff here. So I'll pause there.
I don't know if they are. That was beautiful stuff. I mean, even the idea that sex is good and beautiful and is a gift, because you often see that the greater idols are kind of brought into existence because it's the exploitation of a greater gift, right? And so you see this fascination with sex, and the physical, and the ways that it's exploited are just horrendous. But like even at a cultural level, where it's like sex is a very powerful thing, and so you look at the exploitation, you can start to get I think it's a dull glimmer of like the gift that it is. I mean, it has the ability to create, but it's also, I mean, it's the most intimate you can be with someone else. So even your articulation of sex being good and beautiful and right, I think is extraordinarily helpful and healthy. And there's a sense in which when sex is violated, it creates scars that sometimes never go away. Right. And so the idea then of covenant, even at an intuitive level, I think it has a lot of intuitive power just to speak into that. I mean, I don't think just using scripture, like people were like, oh, well, I don't adhere to scripture as an authority. And it's like, well, honestly, like so much of the way we live, our psychology, our biology, the way we exist in relationships, reinforces the authority of Scripture on this matter. That covenant is sacred and good and beautiful, and it's there to protect us. You know, it allows for that play as well as that protection. And so I appreciate a lot of what you're saying.
But we make sex the quintessential, like it's almost the Mount Everest of issues, right? So, adultery, these are all sins, right? Clearly, they're sins and they're issues. But we make it, I think, as a unique category. Now, it is a unique category in the sense that Paul expresses in 1 Corinthians that sexual sin is a sin against the body. There is some type of physical union that puts sexual sin in a unique category. Yeah. If you join yourself with a prostitute, there is something mystical, spiritual, theological, and physical taking place there that is unique from other sins. At the same time, when I experience sexual sin and violation, because you kind of brought up that issue, that doesn't have to define me either. Let me share a story that a lot of people don't know, and I hope it's appropriate in this context. But I was molested by a man in my sleep when I was a teenager. I was about 14. Became extremely suicidal, was messed up for years. One of the reasons that was so defining for me was because it was a sexual sin. Yeah. I've had people steal from me. I've had people lie to me. I've had people call me bad names, and those things affected me. They did not affect me on the level that sin affected me. And yet, as I look back, it was horrendous. It was horrible. But it doesn't have to define me. And what we often do is, because we have desires or issues that happen in the sexual realm with us, we allow those to define us. So in our day and age, we even come up with gender terms and preferences and statements. And it's almost like the old commercials, I'm a Mac, I'm a PC. We try to allow our sexual identity to define us. And I don't think the Bible ever intended for it to be the defining element in our lives. It is an element of our life. And it's an element that we can bring under control, that we can bring into mastery. I mean, our desires are there, but they don't have to drive us. We need to acknowledge them. And so we live in a culture that thinks if I have this desire, and I'm created by God, it must be by God, therefore I have the freedom to explore that. That's not the biblical picture of desires or creation or any of that stuff. And it's certainly, we need to be careful when we enter into the sexual experience and realm.
First off, thanks for sharing that story.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying, it's something another guest on here named Preston Sprinkle had said, and he said that our anthropology must precede our sexual ethic, which I hear you saying something similar, where it's like, yeah, it's an aspect of who we are, but it's not the entirety of who we are. And I think a lot of the genderized conversation makes then sexuality the entirety of our identity, which is, I think it's detrimental. I think it's dangerous, because there is so much more to who we are. And I was wondering, it does kind of necessitate the question then, like, what else is there? What else would you say there is to our humanity beyond our sexuality? Do you have kind of a out of the pocket kind of question for something like that?
So, I mean, let's just glance at the scriptures a little bit. I mean, ultimately, because of my conviction as being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus, being someone who believes he is the Son of God, who lived a law in fulfillment of the law. He lived a life in fulfillment of the law that was perfect. Yeah. He died, was buried, rose again as my substitute on the cross, right? That he is the Passover lamb, that whoever places their faith in him will be born again. They can become children of God. Well, because of that recolors everything I have. So when I look at like John 1:12, issues of sonship, that to as many as believed in Jesus, to as many as received him, to them, he gave the right to become a children of God. That I now have full access to the riches of heaven through Jesus. So when I look at the biblical model, Our identity is found in who we are serving. And the Bible breaks up into two categories, right? We are either serving God through Jesus or we are serving something else and someone else. And so that's the issue of identity. I'm either a child of God or I'm not when it comes to the Bible. But in terms of exploration, right, in our anthropology, what are some of those subcategories? I mean, we're humans who eat and enjoy food.
Yeah.
Right, that's what Paul says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it to the glory of God.
Yeah.
There's something special about our humanity that we gather and we eat at tables together. There's something about that fellowship that drives us. There's family brings identity. That's why people who are adopted, they struggle deeply with their identity. Why? Because they didn't experience family. So that's not sexuality. That is a complete unique experience to our humanity and who we are. A recreation and enjoyment, friendship. David and Jonathan, I mean, a lot of people want to distort that. An honest theologian, even one who advocates for homosexual tendencies and behavior, will look at that text and say that is not a homosexual relationship in the Hebrew culture. That is deep Hebrew friendship.
Yeah.
Right? God designed us to be friends.
Yeah.
A cord of three strands, the writer of Ecclesiastes says, is not easily broken.
Yeah.
So when we talk about our anthropology, our humanity, there's a lot of elements that come to make us up to be human.
Yeah.
One of those is that we have dominion over the earth, that we do bring things into submission. So I could go on and on that issue, but there are all these beautiful subcategories that the Bible gives us that I don't think we actually pause just to contemplate the implication of those things.
No, that's really helpful. I'm nearly 30 and I've been single the entirety of my life, and it's taken me a long time to excavate some of those resources of my own humanity that I can live out in beautiful ways, because so much of identity is articulated as sexualized in our culture. And so learning to take a step away from that and not just jettison the whole thing because I've seen it practiced poorly, but like keep that in as a part of the body of my identity, but at the same time continue to learn learning how to serve, learning how to be a son, learning how to love well, learning how to practice family and friendship. Those sorts of things are really wholesome and beautiful, and there's a lot of exploration inside of them. And I think, well, I mean, even Paul and Jesus exhort us in those directions at different points, where it's like, no, like you can get a lot of stuff done for the kingdom in singleness in really beautiful ways and really unique ways. And so like learning to take that seriously and practice it, and even to know covenant with the household of faith, and not just exclusively assuming that covenant is for those who are married and they only get to taste of that aspect of the kingdom, has been a big part of my own journey. So it's helpful.
Yeah, there's a guy named Hellerman who wrote a book called When the Church Was a Family. And it's really, really good on that issue. So if you ever want to look it up.
I will. Thank you, man. I appreciate it. So that's all super helpful. Jumping into application.
Okay.
Yeah. How do you take those things and make it palatable for people? Obviously, you counsel a ton of people. You counsel pastors, and you walk through this with community. And I guess I'm wondering at a methodological level, like when it comes to just method, is it how do you approach it? Is it circumstantial, or are there kind of just pieces that you always have no matter what, and then you kind of clothe it within the context? How does that work for you?
So when I'm addressing individuals?
Yeah, or trying to impart a healthy biblical sexual ethic to a community or an individual.
So there's a variety of things I do. I customize a lot of what I do, but there's some basic principles. So let me just give you one idea here. I do this where a lot of times I get asked to address issues of sexuality regarding homosexuality. That's a huge topic in our culture that you can get, for lack of a better term, nailed to the cross, right? Very, very quickly when you address that, if you're on the wrong side of culture.
Yeah.
And so when I look at Romans 1 and other places, I think sexuality comes out in Romans 1 as well as Galatians 5 and other places. And I tell people this: desire does not justify sin. You see, we have this approach, whether it's sexuality, whether it's food, whether it's self-esteem and counsel, that God's desire is for you to become your truest self. That's absolutely not God's design for you. God's design for you is to die to self and to become a servant of Christ. Right? Galatians 2:20, for I've been crucified with Christ, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. It is me understanding, as 1 Corinthians 15:4-5 says, for I'm compelled by the love of Christ. Me understanding the love of God that was poured out on me, an enemy of God, Romans 5:8, that I am now through Christ reconciled to God, though I was a wretched sinner. And through experience of his grace, that I have died to self, I have associated with a crucified criminal, and I'm now alive for him. But that's it. I'm not just alive with him, I'm alive for him. And so whatever it is, just because I have desires, that doesn't justify my sin. I can't do whatever I want simply because I desire to do it. Denying that desire is not denying your identity. It is denying your impulse. And we're all called to keep those impulses in check to the glory of God. Yeah. And so that's one of the things I do as well. The other thing I deal with a lot on this issue is Galatians 5:16. Walk by the Spirit and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. And here's the thing I bring up. I have people in terms of their sexual identity going, I have these ungodly sexual desires. And they wear them down and they feel so guilty because those desires exist that they find themselves gravitating towards sin. Yeah. They eventually go, well, I feel this way, I might as well give in, right? Yeah. And I take them to this verse, and I do this in groups of people often, and I'll say, look at this text. Walk by the Spirit, you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. Paul is speaking to believers here in Galatia. They have desires of the flesh. No matter how godly you become in the Christian walk, you will have desires that are contrary to the things of the Spirit of God. So here's the key. A godly person is not someone who is exempt from ungodly desires. A godly person is someone who, despite ungodly desires being present, they choose to submit themselves to the will of God, to the Spirit of God specifically in the text. And so that is a huge framework that I use to approach this. And it can be customized, obviously, because everyone's scenario is different. Yeah. But those two issues of desire not justifying sin, and that godliness is not the absence of ungodly desire. Godliness is choosing to submit to the Spirit over those ungodly desires. Those are really important, I think.
Yeah. Amen, dude. Amen. I can't help but ask the question, when it comes to this particular issue, obviously it's not your job, it just comes up in your job, in that sense. It's not like you or a sex therapist, or something like the sex addict. Are you?
No.
It's like, I was correcting me.
No. Let me address just something you brought up was really important.
Yeah.
I was first exposed to pornography when I was 5 years old. Yeah. It was through a variety of means. I'm not going to go into all that. I was first taught, by the way, by a family member how to masturbate at 11. By the way, at 11 was also when my sister was killed in a boating accident, tragically. Had a lot of trauma at that point in time in my life. Was actively addicted to hardcore pornography from the age of 12 to 16. The Lord gets a hold of my life at 15 and a half, almost 16. And I started going to church. I mean, when I say got a hold of my life, he radically said I was in a car accident, I should have died. I began to think about heaven and hell and the Father looking at me. I knew some Bible verses from being a child. Well done, good and faithful servant. And the filth I felt, the idea of how could God love me? John 3:16, for God so loved the world. How could God love me? I don't even love myself. I don't even like myself. Yeah. The thought of the love of God wrecked me as a 15-year-old. So I had this dramatic change where I understood the love of God in a fresh way. So I started living for Jesus. I publicly had made a commitment to Christ. Anyway, I ended up in Bible college. So I go in the Marine Corps. I was faithful for 4 years in the Marine Corps. Loved it. Get out to go to Bible college to go into full-time ministry. And I started struggling with porn again. Hadn't in years, really. I mean, I'd struggled, but I hadn't given in. I started giving in on the internet. The internet's become more prominent. Yeah, I'm an old dude, so no one wanted to talk about it. I want to talk about masturbation. I want to talk about struggles. And I don't want to stand up in front of mixed groups and just make it a profane thing. But I want to bring it into the light. I want to say, this is not right. I will not live. I was taught that I was just this dirty sinner who needed to muddle his way through. This is in Bible college. Yeah. Who needed to muddle his way through and just do his best until Jesus comes back. Yeah. Now I thought there's got to be more to the Christian life than this. There's got to be more to the Christian life and the abundant life Jesus promised than to muddle my way through saddled with this sin. Yeah. So I'm talking to everyone and no one wanted to talk about it. And as I found freedom in Jesus and found out that I did not have to live in bondage to sin. Matter of fact, not only did I not have to, I wasn't supposed to. That I could, and God wanted me to walk in holiness. I committed I was going to talk to everybody about this issue. And so God began to open up doors as a young man, and more people started coming to me, to the point now where I primarily only work with church leaders because I'd be exhausted. I wouldn't have enough time. But it was birthed out of this issue that no one wanted to talk about it. And, here I was in a Bible college, and it was like, yeah, we're not going to talk about that. And going, this is the issue.
Yeah.
So through that experience, God just began to bring more and more people into my life. And as I found greater freedom in Jesus, I wanted to drag people along with me and say, you can do this. By the glory and the power. You have the power of the resurrected Jesus in you by his Spirit. Are you telling me he can't deal with the sin in your life? He can. You just have to change your behavior, right? And I always tell people this, want to won't get you there. You've got to make real changes in your life. Anyway, we could go on and on about that, but so you were saying I wasn't a sex therapist, and this is how I kind of got into that, but I'll let you go wherever you want to go from there.
No, I think you preemptively already answered the question. The question would have been something like, how significant do you think or see this issue to be? Because I know that you meet with pastors and you meet with students all the time. And so then just curious to see kind of your communication of like, what do you see as, how detrimental do you see this issue being?
This issue is the cancer that no one wants to really name. And I say that's not really fair, because more and more people are talking about it. I mean, you have more and more organizations like we're experiencing here today. They're saying, you know what? Forget that.
Yeah.
I don't care what some people say isn't appropriate for the church to talk about. The church, it's appropriate for the church to address all issues of creation for the glory of God, right? And so, this is a worthy issue. You asked me, you kind of made a comment in there of, when you see guys, how prevalent do you think this is? When I walk into a room, now I'm a little cynical here. I assume 8 out of 10 guys recently have viewed pornography. Like I just assume that 10 out of 10 are struggling with it, and 8 out of 10 are probably indulging in it.
Yeah.
Now, I don't freak out about that, but I just assume this is such a prevalent issue in our culture, and technology has been that two-edged sword that has made it so accessible, where I can hide behind the mask of a monitor with anonymity, and I can be whoever I want to be on that screen. And so there's no accountability that before public persona would keep you in check. Remember, God provided government and laws and the Spirit and all of these things and persons, which the Spirit is a person, to help restrain sin. There's something about the power of technology that helps remove those inhibitions and allows you, or removes those restraints and allows you to act out inhibitions, and you can be whoever you want to be. It is a huge issue in our culture, and it's not going away.
Adam, that's as good a note to end on as I could conceive of. Is there anything else that you would want to share?
Oh man, I've said so much already. I'm humbled that I would be able to be a part of this conversation. I hope people find it fruitful, and just to encourage those people that whatever the issue is, we need to learn how to think through the story of the gospel, the story of the scriptures, and God redeeming his people and establishing his kingdom for the end of the age. And I think we need to learn to think through issues where all issues are informed by the gospel. The gospel isn't a subcomponent. The gospel is a lens through which we understand all issues. And I really think in our church today, we need to grow in how we read and understand the scriptures according to the intent that God has for it. And I encourage your audience to never quit being a student of the word, so that, like Paul said to Timothy, they would be people who are faithful students of the word, so they rightly divide the word of truth.
Yeah. Amen, dude. Yeah, there are always, any worldly solution to a problem is always going to be kind of a false or a truncated gospel, so to speak. It's a broken good news. And you see that especially now with the isolation with pornography, because a lot of people are isolated. They don't know what to do with their loneliness. They're longing for intimacy. Consequently, there's this huge spike in pornography, and porn sites are marketing like never before,
right.
So they're saying, hey, we've got good news for your loneliness. We've got good news for your isolation and your lack of intimacy. And again, there's that spike. And so it's helpful to know, honestly, it's helpful to hear you play out, not just what you're saved from, but also what you're saved for, right? And to play out those there's multi-dimensional, multifaceted aspects of the gospel, of the good news, because it's not just like, hey, like, yeah, right, like you're a piece of trash and God saved you, now just wait for heaven. It's like, no, like, what is that abundant life, and how can I know identity and personhood the way he designed me to be, but I've never been able to be without him, right? What is he saving me for? So you playing out some of those pieces, a lot of those pieces, is really, really helpful.
And I know when we talk about how prevalent this is, just a quick story.
Yeah.
I was over in Indonesia, the highest concentration of proclaimed Muslims in the world, right? We tend to think about them as being very pure in their sexuality. And I was asked to speak on this issue over there to young men. All of them struggle with this. And it was interesting. They had a big debate on whether they were going to let me use a microphone, because if it was heard in public, we were in a hangar kind of building. If it was heard in public, it risked a riot because of their culture and their values and their laws and all this stuff like that. And they pulled me aside before I got to speak at this conference, and they said, don't expect anyone to come forward. This is a shame issue and an honor and shame culture. But they said, but we want you to, after the debate happened, all the leaders said, like, we want you to go ahead and talk about this issue. So they did let me use the microphone. They just closed the doors of the hangar to try to limit the sound from getting into the community. I got up and speak. At the end of it, as soon as I offered the invitation of responding to what God has called us to, right, what you're talking about, but we had about 60 men present, all but like 3 ran up and threw themselves on the altar crying in repentance. That is profound. So you talk about how prevalent this is. This is not just an American issue. This is a worldwide pandemic, to use a term that we understand right now. Yeah. The irony isn't lost on us that one global crisis is trying to be mitigated by another global crisis.
Right. That because I think in 16 states now, pornography has been registered as a health crisis. So then all of a sudden you see like, hey, like we've got medicine for your disease, and that's pornography. The ugly irony is blatant, and so it's helpful just to play out some of this stuff, and trace the thread all the way to the quilt, so to speak, and to follow the images on the tapestry, because I think that irony is lost on a lot of people. I think that they do think this is a private sin that doesn't impact other people, and they cope with what they're doing with themselves by medicating themselves with the pleasure of the activity. And so if they can always stay hidden within that pleasure, then they think they're fine because it's not touching anybody else. But you have, the story you started with about that pastor, it's like, he dug that grave with, what did you say, a teaspoon or something like that?
Yeah, one teaspoon at a time.
Yeah, it's gnarly to see. And I think we're doing that to ourselves on a global scale, especially, well, at least relevantly here in the West, but certainly elsewhere. Because even now, like instances of sex trafficking and its direct connection to pornography is becoming more blatant here in North America, and so how much more so in other places where the government isn't so intentional on those kinds of issues.
Right.
So it's helpful. I think all of this matters a ton. So thank you.
Good. Thanks.
Yeah. So if someone wants to track with some of your thoughts, I know you have a book coming out this summer. Is that what you said?
That's right. Yep.
So how can people stay connected with you, your work, your thoughts? Tell us a bit about that, and also the book that's coming out, if you're up for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done a lot of blogs in the past. I really backed off my blogging a lot just because I've been so busy. I do a lot of mentoring, lead some Bible studies. I take the call to be a disciple maker seriously, and so I spend a lot of time doing that, which impacts ability to write and things. Sure. But I have a lot of blogs on For the Church, which is www.ftc.co. ftc.co. I forgot for a minute. There we go. Yeah. I've also written a few books. One was based on my dissertation, so it's very theologically oriented. It's Paul's Spirituality in Galatians, but the other 2 books are more practical and accessible for people, and I think they would enjoy them. One, Square One, Back to the Basics, and it's saying, hey, look, when we talk about the issues of the gospel and other issues, what are we talking about? And it's 10 chapters to kind of say, let's go back and make sure we understand what it means to know God and walk with Him, and what is it that God expects of the Christian life at a basic level. And it's written, I think, in a way they can access it. The other book is called Timeless Church, and it comes out in July. And it's 5 characteristics of the early church that should be prevalent in our churches today. But if people want to track me, they can access me there. I also had started a ministry that I still direct somewhat. I'm less and less involved. And it's called New Line Ministries, and they can email me through that as well.
Sweet. Sweet. Adam, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah,
It's
thanks so
been,
much.
A real privilege just to be with you. I've enjoyed it through and through.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah. Guys, thank you for hanging with us. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did enjoy it, would you mind just leaving us a positive review? We will catch you next time.